On Mother's Day, I set the table for 6, lit the candles, and waited until the wax melted down to nothing before I realized I had been erased from my own family. I remember checking the time on the wall clock, 6:15 p.m., thinking maybe they were just running late. Maybe traffic was heavier than usual. Maybe my son Daniel had forgotten to text me. The house smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary, the way it always had when the family came over, and for a moment, I let myself believe everything was still normal. I adjusted the napkins, smoothed the edges of the tablecloth, even reheated the gravy twice so it would be perfect when they arrived. That's what mothers do, even at 68. We prepare. We wait. We make excuses for the people we love. My phone sat beside my plate, screen dark, silent. No calls. No messages. Just a reflection of my own face staring back at me, looking older than I remembered. By 7 p.m., the chicken had gone dry. The candles had burned low, and the silence in the house felt louder than any argument. I picked up my phone and opened social media without thinking, just to distract myself, just to fill the quiet. And that's when I saw it. A photo. Bright. Cheerful. Daniel standing with his arm around Sophie. Both of them smiling like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Their kids were there too, holding little bouquets of flowers, standing beside another woman, Sophie's mother. The caption read, "Celebrating Mother's Day with the most amazing mom. We love you." I stared at that photo longer than I should have. My thumb hovered over the screen, as if I could swipe it away and undo what I had just seen. But it didn't change. It didn't disappear. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. I set my phone down carefully, as if it were something fragile, something that might shatter if I moved too quickly. The room felt different then, colder. Not because the temperature had changed, but because something inside me had shifted. I looked at the empty chairs around the table, Daniel's seat, Sophie's seat, the kids' seats, and for the first time, I didn't imagine them being filled. I didn't picture their laughter or their voices. I just saw the emptiness for what it was. Real. Intentional. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't ask why. I simply stood up, walked into the kitchen, and turned off the oven. The quiet followed me, steady and unbroken. Some people think silence means weakness, that if you don't speak, you don't understand what's happening around you. But that night, as I washed the dishes no one used and wrapped the untouched food in foil, I realized something they didn't expect. Silence isn't empty. It's where the truth settles. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally ready to listen. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:30, the way I always did, even though there was no one coming over, no reason to rush, no reason at all except habit. The house was quiet in that heavy way that settles into the walls after a long night, and for a moment, I just sat on the edge of my bed, listening to it. I expected to feel something sharp, something overwhelming, but what I felt instead was steady, controlled, as if whatever had cracked inside me the night before had already begun to harden into something else. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, the same mug Daniel had given me years ago with the words "World's Best Mom" printed across the front. The letters had faded over time, worn down from years of washing, just like everything else that had once felt certain. I took a slow sip and looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden I had spent years tending, even after my husband passed, even when my knees ached and my hands stiffened in the cold. I had kept everything alive. That had always been my role. To maintain, to give, to make sure everyone else had what they needed. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether anyone was doing the same for me. I did not check my phone right away. I let it sit on the counter while I moved through my morning routine, making toast, rinsing the dishes from the night before, folding the dish towel neatly over the sink. It was only after I finished that I picked it up. 3 notifications, all from people who were not my family. A message from a neighbor wishing me a happy Mother's Day, sent late. A promotional email. A reminder for a doctor's appointment next week. Nothing from Daniel. Nothing from Sophie. Not even a simple message from the children. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set it face down on the counter again. That was when the memories started to come back, not in a rush, but slowly, like pieces of something I had ignored for too long finally arranging themselves into a clear picture. The birthday dinner 2 years ago when they said they were too busy to come, but later I saw photos of them at a restaurant across town. The school recital I had been told was rescheduled, only to find out it had happened exactly as planned. The holidays that grew smaller each year, with less space for me and more excuses that sounded polite but felt rehearsed. At the time, I told myself it was coincidence, miscommunication, life getting in the way. But standing there in my kitchen, holding that fading coffee mug, I realized something I should have seen much earlier. It was not one moment. It was a pattern. Careful, consistent, intentional. I walked over to the drawer by the fridge and pulled it open, the one where I kept old receipts, notes, and small things I never quite threw away. Inside were cards the children had made when they were younger, drawings of stick figures holding hands, uneven letters spelling out grandma. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling the texture, remembering a time when my presence had been something they reached for, not something they quietly removed. I closed the drawer gently and stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle again. This time, it did not feel as heavy. It felt clearer, like a room after the windows have been opened. And for the first time, I did not wonder why they had not come. I understood that they were never planning to. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar, as if it had been waiting for me to notice the quiet all along. I moved through each room slowly, not looking for anything in particular, just observing what had always been there. The hallway still held the framed photos I had carefully arranged over the years, each one capturing a moment that once felt permanent. Daniel at 10 years old, holding up a science fair ribbon with that proud, crooked smile. The children when they were younger, sitting on my living room floor surrounded by wrapping paper on Christmas morning. Sophie standing beside them in one of the earlier photos, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, her smile warm, almost convincing. I stopped in front of that photo longer than I expected to, studying it in a way I never had before. Back then, I had believed that smile meant inclusion, that it meant I had gained a daughter, not lost a son. It is strange how memory softens things at first, how it wraps uncomfortable truths in something gentler so we can accept them more easily. But standing there now, I could see the details I had missed. The way her eyes never quite matched her smile. The way she stood just slightly in front of me, not beside me. Small things. Easy to ignore. Easy to dismiss. Until they are not. I continued down the hall and stepped into the spare bedroom, the one I had slowly turned into a space for the grandchildren. The shelves still held books I had bought for them, stories I used to read aloud in the evenings while they curled up beside me. A small blanket lay folded at the end of the bed, one I had stitched by hand years ago. I picked it up and ran my fingers across the fabric, remembering how they used to fight over who got to use it, how they would laugh and tug at it until I stepped in to settle the argument. Those moments had felt so simple then, honest, uncomplicated. I set the blanket back down carefully, exactly where it had been, and stepped back into the hallway. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved, like something that had been left behind on purpose. I walked back into the kitchen and sat at the table, the same table that had been set for 6 the night before. I had already cleared the plates, wiped the surface clean, but I could still see where everything had been placed. Habit leaves its marks even after everything else is gone. I folded my hands together and rested them on the table, letting my thoughts settle into something clearer, something more precise. This was not about a missed holiday. It was not about one dinner or one message that never came. It was about a shift that had been happening quietly, over years, moving me further and further to the edge until there was no space left for me at all. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that someone had been guiding that shift, shaping it in ways that were subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but consistent enough to change everything. Sophie. I said her name quietly, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with recognition. She had never needed to raise her voice or create scenes. She had worked in smaller ways, in suggestions, in decisions made without me, in moments where I was not included and was expected not to notice. And I had not. Not until now. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room one more time, taking in the details I had once taken for granted. The clock on the wall, the light coming in through the window, the steady, unbroken quiet. I did not feel confused anymore. I did not feel uncertain. For the first time, everything made sense, not in a way that brought comfort, but in a way that brought clarity. And clarity, I realized, was far more powerful than anything I had been holding on to before. That afternoon, I sat in the same chair by the window where I used to watch Daniel play in the backyard when he was small, when his world was still simple enough that he would run back to me every few minutes just to make sure I was still there. I remember how he used to call out, "Mom, watch this," before every small achievement, every jump, every throw, every moment he wanted someone to see. And I always did. I watched everything. I clapped. I encouraged. I made sure he felt seen. That was what motherhood meant to me. Not grand gestures, not perfect moments, but being present in the quiet, ordinary seconds that built a life. I closed my eyes for a moment and let those memories come forward, not to comfort me, but to understand what had changed. Because something had. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It happened slowly, in ways that are easy to excuse at first. I thought about the first time Sophie suggested they host Thanksgiving at her mother's house instead of mine. She had smiled when she said it, her tone light, reasonable. "It will just be easier this year," she said. And I had agreed, because it seemed small, because I did not want to make things difficult. Then the next year, it happened again. And the year after that. Until it was no longer a suggestion. It was simply the way things were done. I thought about the time I offered to watch the children for a weekend, the way I always had, only for Sophie to gently decline, saying they had already made other arrangements. But later, I found out they had left the children with a sitter, a stranger. At the time, I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe they did not want to impose. But sitting there now, I understood it differently. It was not about convenience. It was about control, about deciding where I fit, and more importantly, where I did not. Sophie never raised her voice. She never said anything openly cruel. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, she worked through absence, through quiet exclusions that left no clear moment to challenge, no single incident I could point to and say, "This is wrong." And Daniel, my son who once needed me for everything, began to follow that pattern without question. He would nod when she spoke, agree when she decided, and over time, he stopped asking me for my opinion altogether. I tried to remember the last time he had called just to talk, not out of obligation, not as part of a plan, but simply because he wanted to hear my voice. I could not. The realization did not hit me like a wave. It settled in slowly, like something that had been waiting patiently for me to notice it. I opened my eyes and looked out at the backyard again, at the space that had once been filled with noise and movement, now quiet and still. I had spent years believing that if I continued to give, to support, to remain steady, everything would stay connected. But connection, I realized, is not maintained by one person alone. It requires something in return. And somewhere along the way, that balance had disappeared. I stood up from the chair and walked back into the house, my steps steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been in a long time. This was not a sudden loss. It was the result of many small choices, repeated over time, until they formed something permanent. And now that I could see it for what it was, I also understood something else. If something had been built slowly, it could also be undone the same way. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with intention. The same quiet kind they had used all along. The following day, I did something I had not done in a long time. I left the house without a plan, without a list, without a reason that needed to be justified. I drove past the grocery store where I used to shop for family dinners, past the bakery where I would pick up the children's favorite pastries on weekends, and I kept going until the streets felt unfamiliar enough to quiet my thoughts. I parked near a small cafe I had never noticed before, the kind of place that did not rely on routine customers, but on people who were simply passing through. Inside, it was quiet. A few people sat alone with their coffee, reading or working, not looking up, not expecting anything from anyone else. I ordered a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the cup, letting the stillness settle in a different way than it had at home. No memories attached to this place. No expectations. Just space. I watched people walk by outside, each one moving with purpose, each one part of a life I knew nothing about. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that my life did not have to revolve around waiting for someone to include me. It could exist on its own. The thought did not feel dramatic or empowering. It felt simple, clear. I took a slow sip of my coffee and reached into my purse, pulling out a small notebook I had carried for years but rarely used. The pages were mostly empty, except for a few scattered notes, reminders, grocery lists from months ago. I turned to a blank page and sat there for a moment, pen in hand, not quite sure what I intended to write. Then, slowly, I began. Not about what had happened, Not about the disappointment or the silence, but about facts, practical things, the house, the savings account, the small investments my husband and I had built over decades, carefully, steadily, things I had always considered part of a shared future. I wrote down numbers, locations, names of documents, details I had not reviewed closely in years because I had assumed there was no need to. As I wrote, I felt something shift again, not emotionally this time, but mentally, like a part of my mind that had been set aside was waking up. I finished my coffee and closed the notebook, slipping it back into my purse with a sense of purpose that felt new, but also familiar in a way I could not quite place. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. Sharper, clearer. I got back into my car, and instead of heading home right away, I made one more stop. A small office building on the corner of Maple and 3rd, one I had passed countless times, but never entered. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the sign by the door, then turned off the engine. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply stepped out, walked inside, and asked the receptionist if they had availability for a consultation later that week. She smiled politely, checked her schedule, and nodded. "We can fit you in on Thursday at 10 in the morning," she said. I thanked her, wrote down the time, and left without explaining anything further. Back in my car, I placed the appointment card on the passenger seat and looked at it for a moment before starting the engine. It was a small step, quiet, unnoticed by anyone else. But as I pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward the life I had always known, I understood something with complete certainty. I was no longer waiting to be remembered. I was preparing to be seen differently. Thursday morning arrived with a quiet kind of precision, the kind that does not demand attention but carries weight all the same. I dressed more carefully than usual, not out of habit, but out of intention. A pressed blouse, a simple pair of slacks, the pearl earrings my husband had given me years ago, not for anyone else to notice, but because I did. Because I was beginning to understand that the way I showed up for myself mattered just as much as how I had shown up for others all these years. The drive to the office on Maple and 3rd was calm, the streets lined with early traffic, people moving through their routines without knowing that anything had shifted in the world around them. I parked, checked the time on the dashboard, and stepped out with steady hands. Inside, the office was quiet, organized, everything in its place. The receptionist recognized me and offered a polite smile before guiding me to a small waiting area. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, feeling not nervous, not anxious, just clear. When my name was called, I stood and followed the man down a short hallway into his office. He introduced himself, gestured for me to sit, and asked how he could help. For a moment, I simply looked at him, considering how to begin, how to explain something that had taken years to unfold. But then I realized I did not need to explain everything. I only needed to say what mattered. I told him I wanted to review my assets, my home, my accounts, everything that had been built over a lifetime. I told him I wanted to understand my options, not for today, but for what came next. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, asking careful, practical questions that required clear answers. Numbers, dates, ownership, beneficiaries. The conversation was direct, grounded in facts rather than feelings, and that was exactly what I needed. There was something steadying about it, something that did not shift or change based on anyone else's behavior. When he asked about my current beneficiaries, I paused for a brief moment before answering. I gave him the names, hearing them out loud in a way I had not before, as if saying them in that room placed them in a different context. He made notes, then explained what could be changed, what steps would be required, how everything could be structured differently if I chose to move forward. I listened carefully, asking questions of my own, not out of confusion, but out of intention. I wanted to understand every detail, every possibility, every outcome. When the meeting ended, he handed me a folder with information, along with a list of documents I would need to gather if I decided to proceed. I thanked him, stood, and walked out of the office with the same steady pace I had carried in. Back in my car, I placed the folder on the seat beside me and sat there for a moment, looking straight ahead. Nothing had changed on the outside. The same street, the same buildings, the same quiet movement of people going about their day. But something inside me had shifted into place. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but firmly. I started the engine and drove home, the folder resting beside me like something that had been waiting for me to claim it. When I pulled into the driveway and turned off the car, I did not rush inside. I sat there for a few seconds longer, feeling the quiet settle again, but this time it felt different. It was no longer empty. It was intentional. And for the first time, I understood that what I was building now did not require anyone else's permission. The next few days passed quietly, but it was not the same kind of quiet I had known before. This time, it felt structured, almost deliberate, as if each hour had a place and a purpose, even if no one else could see it. I moved through my routines the same way I always had, watering the plants in the morning, preparing simple meals, keeping the house in order, but beneath those familiar motions, something had shifted. I was paying attention now, not to what was missing, but to what I had been overlooking for years. On Saturday afternoon, my phone finally rang. I was in the living room, folding laundry, when I saw Daniel's name appear on the screen. I did not rush to answer. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, not out of spite, but because I no longer felt the urgency I used to. When I picked up, my voice was calm, steady. "Hello, Daniel." There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had expected something different, something warmer, something more eager. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone casual, almost rehearsed. "I was meaning to call you earlier this week. Things have just been really busy." I listened without interrupting, letting the words settle as they were. Busy. That was the word he had used before. The same explanation, repeated enough times that it had started to sound reasonable, even when it was not. "I see," I said simply. There was another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him, searching for something else to say, something that would fill the space I had not rushed to close for him. "We were thinking of coming by next weekend," he added, his voice shifting slightly, more purposeful now. "The kids would love to see you." I folded the last piece of laundry carefully, placing it in the basket beside me before responding. "Next weekend does not work for me," I said. My tone did not change. It did not need to. Silence followed, heavier this time, not because of what I had said, but because of what I had not said. I had not asked why they had not come. I had not mentioned the photo, the message, the empty table. I had not given him the opportunity to explain something I already understood. "Oh," he replied, caught off guard. "Well, maybe the weekend after that." I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed time to think, but because I was choosing my answer carefully. "I will let you know," I said. There was a subtle shift in the conversation after that, something unspoken but noticeable, as if the balance had changed in a way he could not quite define. He spoke a little longer, mentioning work, the children's schedules, small details that felt more like filler than connection. I responded politely, briefly, not withdrawing, but not stepping forward either. When the call ended, I set my phone down on the table and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet return. It did not feel empty anymore. It felt controlled, measured. I stood up, carried the folded laundry to the bedroom, and placed it neatly in the drawer. Each movement was precise, intentional, not rushed, not distracted. I was not reacting anymore. I was deciding. And somewhere, whether he realized it yet or not, Daniel had felt it. The shift was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And this time, it was not something that could be quietly undone. I did not reach out again after that call, and more importantly, I did not feel the need to. The days that followed moved with a quiet consistency, each one reinforcing something I had only just begun to understand. I was no longer filling the silence with anticipation. I was allowing it to exist exactly as it was, without trying to soften it or explain it away. On Tuesday afternoon, I gathered the documents the attorney had mentioned, one by one, from places I had not opened in years. The safe in the hallway closet, the file cabinet in the study, old folders labeled in my husband's careful handwriting, each one holding a piece of the life we had built together. I sat at the dining table, the same one that had been set for 6 not long ago, and began sorting through everything with steady hands. Deeds, account statements, insurance policies. Each document told a story, not of emotion, but of effort, of years spent planning, saving, protecting what we believed would support the family long after we were gone. I read each page carefully, not skimming, not rushing, making notes where I needed to, placing small markers between sections that required attention. There was no anger in what I was doing, no sense of urgency driven by fear, only clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see something without distraction. As I worked, my phone remained on the counter, untouched. It lit up once in the late afternoon with a message from Sophie. A simple one. Hope you are doing well. Let us know when you are free. I glanced at the screen, read the words, and set the phone back down without replying. Not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood the difference now between responding and reacting. They were not the same. I finished organizing the documents just before evening, stacking them neatly into a folder I had prepared, each section labeled, each detail accounted for. When I closed the folder, I rested my hand on top of it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not as a burden, but as something solid, something real. Later that night, I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, the quiet surrounding me in a way that felt almost familiar now. I thought about the message again, about the timing of it, about how it came only after Daniel's call, as if it were part of a pattern I had already begun to recognize. Careful, measured, always just enough to maintain the appearance of connection, never enough to create anything genuine. I did not feel the need to challenge it. I did not feel the need to question it. I simply observed it for what it was. The next morning, I placed the folder by the door, ready for my next appointment. I moved through the house once more, checking small things, straightening what did not need straightening, not out of habit, but out of awareness. This was still my space, my life, my decisions. And for the first time in a long while, I was not adjusting myself to fit into someone else's expectations. I was allowing everything to align with mine. As I picked up my keys and stepped outside, I paused briefly at the doorway, looking back into the house, not with sadness, not with hesitation, but with recognition. Nothing had been taken from me that I could not reclaim in a different way. And this time, I would not wait for anyone to notice. The second appointment was shorter than the first, but it carried more weight in ways that were not immediately visible. I arrived a few minutes early, the folder in my hands now organized, complete, every document exactly where it needed to be. When I sat across from the attorney again, there was no hesitation in my voice this time. I did not speak in general terms. I spoke in decisions. We reviewed everything carefully, line by line. Each detail explained, each option clarified. He asked if I was certain, not in a way that questioned my judgment, but in a way that respected the permanence of what I was choosing. I met his gaze and nodded. Yes, I said, and that was all that was needed. The paperwork was prepared, signatures placed where they belonged, each page turning with a quiet finality that did not feel heavy, but precise. When it was done, he gathered the documents, placed them neatly into a new folder, and explained what would happen next, what would be filed, what would be updated, how everything would now reflect the choices I had made. I listened, not because I needed reassurance, but because I understood the importance of every step. When I stood to leave, I felt no rush, no surge of emotion, just a steady awareness that something had shifted into place in a way that could not be undone. Outside, the air was warm, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked to my car slowly, not out of hesitation, but because there was no reason to hurry anymore. When I sat behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel and looked ahead, letting the quiet settle one more time. This silence was not the same as the one I had known before. It was not waiting. It was not empty. It was complete. Later that evening, my phone rang again. Daniel. I glanced at the screen, let it ring once, twice, then answered. His voice carried a different tone this time, something less certain, as if he was stepping into a space he did not fully understand. Mom, we have been trying to figure out a time to come by, he said. The kids miss you. I listened, the words familiar, the pattern clear. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I responded calmly. I have been busy, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Oh, he replied, the words softer now. Well, we can work around your schedule. I could hear the shift, subtle but undeniable. The adjustment. The realization that something had changed, even if he could not yet name it. I looked out the window, at the quiet street, the familiar view that had once felt like the center of everything. I will let you know, I said again, my voice steady, unchanged. After the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat back in my chair, letting the silence return. It did not press in on me. It did not demand anything. It simply existed, calm and unbroken. I thought about the table that had once been set for 6, about the empty chairs, the unanswered calls, the messages that never came. And then I thought about the choices I had made since then, the small, deliberate steps that had led me here. I had not raised my voice. I had not confronted anyone. I had not needed to. Because the truth, once seen clearly, does not require explanation. It requires action. And I had taken mine quietly, in a way they would only begin to understand when it was too late to change it. I stood up, turned off the lights, and walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, my thoughts clear. I had said nothing that day, and that had been the first decision that changed everything.